Wanderer Butz, or Bartz if you're a plebe, is minding his own business when a meteor crashes nearby. He's then thrown into an epic journey with the Princess of Tycoon, an amnesiac old man, and a pirate captain to save the world's crystals from a mysterious ancient evil. Final Fantasy V is very typical of Squaresoft's JRPGs. It is extremely similar to Final Fantasy IV at first glance. It looks like 4 aesthetically, it has the active time battle system from 4, it has the standard items and magic spells from 4. But unlike 4, customization is the name of the game in Final Fantasy V. It has the job system from previous entries in the series and allows you to change your job setups at any time. You're periodically fed new jobs as the game progresses, and the vast majority of them are viable in the right circumstances. If you want to have a thief who can cast white magic, you absolutely can do that. The game also helps facilitate this by making your secondary ability give you benefits as if it were a base job. Giving a job like Dragoon with a weak magic set a magical secondary provides a bonus to your magic casting power. This applies to the Equip X line of abilities. They alter your character stats. Equip Bows gives you not only the ability to equip bows, but also gives you the base strength and agility of a hunter, making it much more worthwhile than you'd think at first glance. The job system as it is has some benefits. If you spent a character's entire career as a physical job, then swap it to a spellcaster like a black mage, they are immediately a top tier caster while they're staying as a black mage. This has implications on how you traverse dungeons. When your white mage runs out of mana midway through a dungeon, you can swap them out to a melee job and swap one of your melee characters, like one of your monks, to become your dedicated white mage for the time being. This lets you have a lot more sustain through dungeons, and you'll need to employ strategies like this. Items in Final Fantasy V are quite weak and very expensive, especially in the early stages of the game. This puts a heavy reliance on MP management and restorative magic. Like I said earlier, Final Fantasy V is very similar to Final Fantasy IV in terms of all production values. It looks similar and functions largely the same. The world map graphics are pretty bland, they aren't the best, and they're a bit dated. But there are unique sprites for every job for every character, which means that the actual amount of sprite work is technically impressive. 4 characters with 22 different sprite sets for each job is a lot of art. The music and sound effects are again pretty typical of the series. There are some standout songs, but it's all very well done. The worst thing about Final Fantasy V is the menu is often really frustrating to navigate. You're frequently shuffling characters' jobs and abilities around. There are a lot of layers to do something that should be simple, just changing a job. Every time you change a job, you have to select a support ability, then adjust your equipment. Once you've learned a lot of abilities, it can be annoying to find a support ability you want as they aren't sorted in alphabetical order. They're sorted by active and passive abilities. It can take a lot longer than you'd think to find a specific ability that you want to assign. There's also a lot of bloat, with a few abilities that are borderline useless and even some overlap. Thieves can learn Flee, and ninjas learn Smoke, which are effectively the same ability, which lets you escape from a battle. This contributes to navigating being much more tedious than necessary. Then finally, you have to do your gear setup. Equipment is optimized every time you change jobs. This frequently puts inferior gear onto your character simply because it has the highest attack or defensive power. There's a good amount of cursed gear in Final Fantasy V that's useful in very specific circumstances, so it's worth keeping. Unfortunately, it constantly gets equipped on your characters because its defenses are through the roof. Even if you don't have cursed gear, frequently you want equipment that has unique traits like coral rings or Hermes sandals, which never get automatically put on. This does sound a lot like nitpicking, but it really wears you down after a while, especially since you have to do it with all 4 of your party members every time you shuffle jobs, and occasionally you'll make a mistake with assigning jobs or abilities and you have to redo the whole process again. Final Fantasy V's story is fairly generic big bad that wants to destroy the world that's typical of the series. Unlike other entries in the series, it does put Exdeath at the forefront fairly early on, and he stays there for the remainder of the game, which is refreshing. Often these games will pull a bit of a bait and switch and you'll be going after one guy only to find it was someone else. Having a set party of 4 with a consistent villain provides a lot of opportunities for these guys to interact together, and it does succeed in this regard. It's an enjoyable adventure with an enjoyable story, but it's not going to be winning any awards otherwise. Final Fantasy V is likely the hardest Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo, but it also has the system that's most exploitable by you, the player. The job system has extremely good implementation in the context of the game, especially in the nature of boss battles. The game knows exactly what you have access to at any given point in the story, and all the bosses are designed around what you have, or what you potentially could have at that point. This makes bosses a problem for you to solve using the tools available to you. This is very apparent early on when you have multiple tactics at your disposal to succeed at any encounter. Just for example, one of the early bosses, Guerrilla, is one of the first tricky fights that can be tackled in a number of ways. Guerrilla only uses powerful physical attacks and will counterattack your party anytime he takes damage. You can enter the battle with knights and use their guard ability, which negates all physical damage. This is especially true if you have 3 characters in critical health, as your guarding knight will automatically cover them, and while guarding you take 0 damage from physicals, which effectively makes you invincible. You can use White Mage's Protect to help soften the blows and keep everyone well healed. You can use the Blue Magic Frog Song, which you can get in the dungeon leading to Guerrilla, to turn Guerrilla into a toad. Even though he untoads himself every turn, you can combine various things like this to completely shut this boss down. You can use a White Mage to silence Guerrilla and then use Frog Song and he'll never be able to untoad itself, trivializing the fight. It's all up to you to utilize the tools in your toolbox to tackle these encounters. But if you don't know what abilities do or what you have available, some bosses can be a very frustrating experience. If you do know what's good and useful, you should experiment. Final Fantasy V is amazing in that a lot of things that would just never work on bosses in other RPGs can be exploited and used effectively here, including instant deaths. All that being said, certain encounters do favor certain jobs or setups. If you happen to not use these jobs during these encounters, it's likely you'll have a much harder time. That's one of the biggest problems with the game, is that to find out what bosses do, you'll likely need to lose. Thankfully, before most major encounters there are save points, and you should be saving frequently, potentially across multiple files, as there are several sections that mark points of no return. Character levels are a lot less useful in Final Fantasy V than job choices and equipment. Levels do play a role, but you can get through the game without doing any real grinding. What matters are your jobs, ability setups, and how you're interacting with the battles. It's one of the few Final Fantasies where grinding for the sake of levels will not ensure your victory. It will help, for sure, but many encounters won't be trivialized just because you spent an hour grinding levels. Final Fantasy V does have a fairly variable length. In the final third of the game, you're given multiple optional objectives which you can choose to do to power up, or you can just ignore and go for the final dungeon. A standard playthrough will be about 14 to 25 hours, depending on how much grinding you do and if you complete the optional objectives. The pacing of Final Fantasy V is excellent. The level curve is good, but not overly important. You're always pushing forward, and the tease of unlocking new jobs in the beginning is fresh and exciting. The world changes twice in Final Fantasy V, and these can be considered points of no return. The world changes are fun, and keep things from getting stale by removing backtracking through previous areas again. To complement this, the dungeons and areas in general are not overly long. You can blaze through multiple dungeons in a play session, whereas other Final Fantasies they can feel endless. The encounter rate is moderate. There will be times when you get nearly back-to-back encounters, but others where you go a long time without one. Random battles are usually quick to get through depending on your party setup though. You'll never really have to grind. All the encounters are beatable by fighting enemies as they come, and by clever use of your job abilities and equipment. Grinding basically just gives you more robust options and a slight edge to your character's HP and stats. One of the major problems is ability point gain. For the majority of the first third of the game, it's 1 to 2 ability points per battle. The second third is about 2 to 3, with occasional spikes. Then in the final third of the game, it's about 3 with spikes to 5 and more. Finally, in the final dungeon, you're thrown ability points like candy in the areas just before the final boss. This makes learning a lot of abilities really long-winded unless you abuse a few key points to grind. It's unfortunate because while the level curve is good, the ability gain curve is not very smooth. If the curve was a little smoother and abilities were doled out more frequently, it wouldn't feel so bad. Some abilities and jobs just take far too long to learn and master, which does feel like a hindrance, especially since a lot of the abilities are lackluster at best. Of course, since there are so many jobs, it's likely that you won't really delve too deep into most of them and just use a few favorites. You can have some fun experiences and get a lot of replayability by choosing to use different compositions in your party or limiting which jobs to use in subsequent playthroughs. It's a really nice way to add replayability or challenge yourself. At recommended playing, games either are ascended to the pantheon of games worthy of your time with a recommendation, or are forced to wallow in the miserable muck of mediocrity with a dismissal. Final Fantasy V may be the best classic Final Fantasy from a design standpoint. You're given tools in the form of jobs and abilities to tackle the game's problems in your own way. There's no one way to solve the problems, and you can succeed through less than ideal setups. You can make multiple playthroughs feel distinct by changing up your party setups, which leads itself well to replayability. It is also one of the quicker Final Fantasies to get through. The graphics aren't exactly groundbreaking, but they get the point across. The sound is exactly what you'd expect from the series, and there's some standout tracks. It is one of the harder Final Fantasies, but if you know what you're doing, you can easily exploit the systems in place to trounce whatever comes your way. That being said, Final Fantasies are generally very easy games, so it's not a big deal. For full disclosure, Final Fantasy V is my favorite Final Fantasy from the Super Nintendo era. Whenever I get the itch to play one of them, I'm rarely excited to pop in 4 or 6. 5 is always what I'm drawn to plug into my Super Nintendo because I enjoy the job system so much, and I think that it has the best pacing and most enjoyable adventure of the 3. I can choose to play it casually, using whatever is effective, or try different combinations of jobs like the 4-job Fiesta and have an enjoyable challenge. If you found Final Fantasy 4 or 6 boring because you didn't have a lot of choice or customization, you might give 5 a chance and you might enjoy it more. Final Fantasy V gets recommended playing's most prestigious verdict of recommended.